In 1878, a former samurai named Kenzo stood waist-deep in a river in the mountains outside Kyoto, waiting for a priest who had already broken the law twice that morning by agreeing to meet him. Kenzo had tried everything else first. That part matters, so hold on to it. He had tried discipline, waking before dawn, drilling forms until his shoulders gave out. He had tried a Western doctor in Kyoto who prescribed tonics and told him to walk more. He had tried business, buying into a silk trading venture that failed within a year. He had tried drinking, which worked for exactly as long as the sake lasted and not 1 hour longer. He was 31 years old, and the only thing he had not tried was the thing that was waiting for him in this river, because that thing had been illegal since 1872. Before we go on, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far this story travels, and if you're loving it so far, join the family by hitting subscribe, because tomorrow we've got something special lined up just for you. 6 years earlier, the new government had outlawed Shugendo, the mountain ascetic tradition of the Yamabushi, the wandering priests who trained in caves and under waterfalls and believed the body could be broken open and reassembled through deliberate hardship. The edict called it superstition. It called it a relic of a Japan that needed to modernize or be swallowed by the powers already circling its ports. Officials burned training manuals. Priests were ordered to register as ordinary Buddhist or Shinto clergy or stop practicing altogether. Most of them complied. A few didn't. Kenzo found one of the few through a servant who owed him a favor and a rumor that took 4 months to run down. The priest's name was Ryusen, and he trained a handful of students in secret, in a gorge 2 hours' walk from the nearest road, under a waterfall that had no name on any map the government had approved. Kenzo's problem had a shape to it, and the shape was this. He had done everything correctly, and it had not worked. He had been raised for a role that no longer existed. 5 years earlier, he could carry 2 swords and collect a stipend and know exactly what his life was for. Then the government abolished the samurai class in a series of edicts that took his rank, his income, and his swords in less time than it takes to walk from one end of Kyoto to the other. Thousands of men absorbed this the same way, by trying to become something new. Merchants, farmers, soldiers in the new conscript army. Kenzo had tried 3 of those 4 things. None of them touched what was actually wrong. He described it to Ryusen the first night, sitting on a rock at the edge of the gorge, because Ryusen asked him to, and because 6 years of failed attempts had worn down whatever pride would have kept him quiet. It is a strange kind of exhaustion, he said, not tired in the legs, tired somewhere behind the eyes, where the wanting used to live. I get up, I work, I eat. None of it reaches me anymore. Ryusen was somewhere past 60, with the kind of stillness that made younger men fidget without meaning to. He listened without interrupting, and when Kenzo finished, he didn't offer comfort. "You came to me because everything sanctioned has failed you," he said. "The doctor, the business, the discipline you already know how to apply." He looked at the water moving past them, fast and cold even in late spring. "What I teach was made illegal because it works on people exactly like you, and the men who wrote that law were afraid of what a country full of people like you might do once they stopped being tired behind the eyes." Kenzo asked what the practice was called. "Misogi," Ryusen said. "Purification. And I will tell you plainly before we begin. It will not comfort you. It will very likely make things worse before it makes anything better. Most men who try it once do not come back for a second time." Ryusen's teaching began the following dawn, and it began with a rule Kenzo didn't expect. "You will not step into the water today," Ryusen said. "You will stand on the bank and watch it. That is the entire lesson." Kenzo waited for the actual instruction. It didn't come. He stood on the bank for 2 hours, watching a waterfall drop 8 feet into a pool, listening to the specific sound cold water makes when it hits cold rock, and by the end of it, he was certain he had wasted a morning. The next day, The same instruction. And the day after. On the fourth morning he pushed back. "I did not walk 2 hours into these mountains to watch a river," he said. "Teach me the practice." "You are already in the practice," Ryusen said. "You simply haven't noticed, because you keep waiting for the part that looks like effort." He crouched at the water's edge. "Every man who comes to me arrives believing that discipline means force, gripping harder, pushing through, outlasting the discomfort by sheer will. That approach works on a sword opponent. It does not work on a waterfall. The water will still be 19 degrees whether you clench your jaw or not. Your body doesn't care how determined you are. It only responds to how you meet it." He stood. "Tomorrow you enter the water, not to conquer it, to stop arguing with it." Kenzo didn't understand what that meant until the 5th morning, when he waded in for the first time and his whole body seized against the cold, every instinct screaming to get out, and Ryusen simply said one word from the bank, "Breathe," and Kenzo realized he had been holding his breath entirely, fighting a battle with the water that the water wasn't even participating in. The moment he exhaled, the cold didn't disappear. It just stopped being an enemy. It became information. He stood under the falling water for 11 seconds before he had to get out. Ryusen told him that was 11 seconds longer than most men manage on their first attempt, and then told him to do it again. Kenzo trained for 6 weeks before he understood what the government had actually banned in 1872, and it wasn't the waterfalls. He raised the question with Ryusen on a morning when his hands had finally stopped shaking within a minute of leaving the water instead of 10. Why would anyone in power care whether men stand under cold water in the mountains? Ryusen sat with the question for a while before answering. Because a man who has done this even a dozen times stops being afraid of discomfort in the way that makes him easy to manage, he said. Fear of discomfort is what keeps a man compliant. Fear of hunger keeps him working a bad wage. Fear of humiliation keeps him silent. Fear of physical suffering keeps him from resisting anything that requires physical suffering to resist. He gestured toward the falls. This teaches the body, directly, without a single word of philosophy, that discomfort can be entered and survived, and even used. Once a man knows that in his bones instead of his head, he becomes very difficult to frighten into obedience. He is not wrong to have banned it, Ryusen added. From where he sits, it is a genuinely dangerous thing to teach a population. Kenzo thought about the 6 years he had spent trying to solve his exhaustion with methods the new government approved of. Steady employment, medical tonics, respectable habits, and understood for the first time why none of them had worked. Every sanctioned solution was built to make him more comfortable. Misogi was the only thing he had tried that was built to make him capable of discomfort instead, and those turned out to be 2 entirely different problems with 2 entirely different solutions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Before the story goes further, it's worth understanding what cold water practice does physiologically, because this isn't only a matter of willpower or mysticism. Sudden cold exposure triggers a sharp activation of the sympathetic nervous system, the same system that fires during a threat. Heart rate spikes, breathing becomes fast and shallow, and the body floods with adrenaline and cortisol. This is the reaction Kenzo fought against on his first morning, the one that made him gasp and want out immediately. Repeated, controlled exposure changes how the body handles that spike. In 2014, researchers at Radboud University in the Netherlands, led by physiologist Otto Music, studied practitioners trained in a modern cold exposure method and found they could deliberately influence their autonomic nervous system and immune response in ways previously thought to be involuntary, releasing adrenaline on command and suppressing inflammatory markers during a controlled infection challenge, effects the untrained control group could not replicate. The mechanism wasn't toughness. It was a trained capacity to shift the nervous system's response deliberately rather than being run by it automatically. There's a parallel from decades earlier. In 1982, Harvard researcher Herbert Benson studied Tibetan monks practicing a heat generation meditation called Tummo in unheated rooms in the Himalayas, and documented them raising their finger and toe temperatures by as much as 17 degrees Fahrenheit through mental technique alone. Different tradition, different mechanism, same underlying principle. A trained mind, exerting measurable physical control over a system the body treats as automatic. What Ryusen was teaching Kenzo had no scientific vocabulary attached to it in 1878, but the body doesn't need the vocabulary to respond. Cold water was simply the tool, applied consistently enough and long enough to teach Kenzo's nervous system a different relationship with sudden stress, one where the spike still happened, but no longer controlled what came after it. Kenzo's real test didn't happen in the gorge. It happened 3 months in, back in Kyoto, on a morning he'd nearly forgotten was coming. The remaining investors in his failed silk venture had called a meeting to discuss what was left of his debt to them, and Kenzo walked in, already knowing how these meetings usually went for him. His chest would tighten before anyone said a word, his thinking would narrow to defense, and he would leave having agreed to terms worse than the ones he arrived to negotiate. This time, one of the investors opened with an accusation that would have flattened him a season earlier, that his judgment couldn't be trusted with money, that the venture's failure was a character problem and not a market problem. Kenzo felt the old reaction start exactly the way it always had, a hot contraction behind the sternum, the urge to defend himself immediately and loudly. And then, without deciding to, he did the thing he'd been doing in the river for 3 months. He noticed the reaction instead of becoming it. He let one breath pass before he spoke. What came out of his mouth wasn't a defense. It was a question. What specifically in the venture's structure would you have done differently, and the room's whole temperature changed? The accusation had been aimed at a man who flinched. Kenzo hadn't flinched, not because he'd forced himself not to, but because something underneath the flinch had actually changed. The meeting that had been built to corner him turned, within minutes, into an actual negotiation. He walked out with terms he could live with. He told Ryusen about it the following week, half expecting the old priest to be unimpressed. Instead, Ryusen nodded slowly. "That is the entire practice," he said. "The waterfall was never about the waterfall. It was training your body to stop treating every hard moment as an emergency. The men in that room only had power over you because your nervous system agreed to panic on command. It stopped agreeing." Kenzo trained with Ryusen for 2 years before the old priest told him something he'd apparently been withholding. "You believe I taught you to withstand cold water," Ryusen said one evening, as Kenzo dried himself by the fire they weren't supposed to have this far into the restricted forest. "I did not. I taught you that your reaction to a threat and your response to it are 2 separate events with a gap between them, and that the gap can be widened with practice until you can actually live inside it. The waterfall was simply the cheapest, most repeatable threat I had access to that wouldn't get either of us killed." He fed a branch into the fire. "Everything else you'll face, a business collapsing, a man insulting you in front of investors, a government that has taken your rank and your swords and told you to be grateful for the new roads. None of it is different in kind from the water. It arrives. Your body reacts before you've had any say in the matter. The only question that has ever mattered is what happens in the gap after that." Kenzo asked how long the gap took to build. "Longer than most men are willing to spend," Ryusen said, "and shorter than you're currently afraid it will take." Kenzo returned to Kyoto for good in 1881, 3 years after he first stood on that riverbank. He didn't become a priest. He didn't rebuild the silk business either. He opened a small dojo instead, teaching swordsmanship to the sons of merchants who had no interest in the old warrior codes but had heard he taught something about composure under pressure that made men better at everything from negotiations to marriage. He never taught anyone to stand under a waterfall. The law hadn't changed, and he had a family to protect. But he taught something adjacent to it, 3 things Ryusen had eventually distilled down for students who couldn't disappear into the mountains for years, the way Kenzo had. The first, when a strong reaction arrives, name it out loud in your own head before you act on it. Not, "I am furious," but "there is fury here." The naming creates the smallest possible gap, and the gap is where the choice lives. The second, when your mind has already run 3 days into a feared future, put your attention on something your body can actually feel right now. The ground under your feet, the temperature of the air, the weight of the cup in your hand. The mind travels, the body cannot. Following the body back is the fastest route home. The third, the one Ryusen considered the actual heart of the practice. Seek out one deliberate, controlled discomfort a day, however small. Cold water on the hands before it's warmed. A hard conversation you've been avoiding. A task you'd rather put off. Not to suffer for its own sake, but to keep reminding the nervous system that discomfort can be entered on purpose and survived, so it stops treating every unexpected hardship as a crisis requiring panic. Shugendo remained illegal in Japan until 1945, 67 years after Kenzo first stood in that river. The government that banned it was right about one thing, even if it never would have said so directly. A man who is no longer afraid of discomfort is genuinely harder to control. He negotiates instead of folding. He speaks instead of staying quiet. He tries again instead of accepting the first outcome he's handed. That was the actual danger the edict was written against. And it's the same thing waiting for anyone willing to enter their own version of that river. That's our story. If you enjoyed it, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell. And tomorrow, more stories are waiting for you. Thanks for watching.